there is a point in the film where a character literally looks and says,
"And that's why we call it Helm's Deep."
And I went, so that's why they call it that. I get it now. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well. I am here to review the latest release in the Lord of the Rings franchise, I guess is what it is now, because we live in a capitalist hellhole. This one, the fantasy anime film, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. Now, technically this video is going to be a review, but I actually want to start off this discussion kind of frame what probably the thumbnail of this video is framed around, which is the discourse around the film. Because, you know, I've been trying less and less to sort of discuss like outrage merchants' takes on, you know, fantasy and IP and science fiction and all that stuff, because I think they just drag the discourse in a direction that just focuses on their grievances and nonsense and bullshit that is usually based in sexism and racism or whatnot. But I actually found the reaction to this film in particular to be really illuminating now, especially that I have seen the film, because I think a lot of the actual outrage at the film, and also not even just the like outrage merchants, but even some of the critical response to the film, I think kind of proves a lot of what this movie is trying to do right and the themes that it's tackling in order to get at some of Tolkien's more deeper themes about compassion and nature and humanitarianism in a really beautiful way. Because at the end of the day, I actually really like this film. I have some criticisms, but I think this is a movie that actually adds a really interesting and wonderful perspective to Lord of the Rings in a way that I really appreciate, and that even stuff like Rings of Power, which I like even though I understand it's a hot mess at times, I like despite itself, let me just say, and put it some ways. Like, I think this film is actually really a much stronger piece that I think is using the adaptation process and telling like another story in the Lord of the Rings universe to add on to and bolster up the themes of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work. And I think the responses to it have sort of illuminated how we think about adaptation and how people try to crystallize works in ways that don't allow us to build upon them. So let me get into this and I'll get into the actual review, but let me start off where I just did, because a lot of the outrage merchants discussing this film have obviously focused on where they tend to always focus on, which is the fact that the movie stars a woman in the lead role. Now, normally these grifters get angry at just women appearing in things at any point, because it sort of is them feeling angry and grievance at the fact that another perspective can enter into their stories. And there's a whole lot of discourse we can get into about just that. But what's even more interesting about this one in particular is they are pointing at the fact that Hera, the lead character, who is the daughter of Helm, one of the kings of Rohan that this story is about, and Helm is one of the characters from Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's appendices, which is what this is based on. Not the Silmarillion, the appendices, because that's what they had the rights to. Again, we live in a capitalist dystopia. That's another discussion. But she's not a character that's there, or at least is briefly mentioned if she is. And so this movie is sort of really building her out. And a lot of them were angry at that fact because a woman, but the way they were justifying that misogyny was through the saying like, oh, she's not there. And you're just doing another story that isn't actually adapting Tolkien's work. But what this movie is trying to do, and it's very upfront about it in like the literal opening monologue of the film, and I'm going to get into light spoilers, I'll let you know if I get into any big spoilers into this, is Éowyn, one of the female characters from The Lord of the Rings, one of the very few female characters from those books. She is narrating and says, like, this is not a story that you will hear in the history books. And that becomes sort of a theme throughout the rest of the work. And I even saw some critics who were critical of the film saying like, oh, that's just a cop-out to say like, oh, we can focus on this character. It's just a way to like say like, oh, and this is why we're explaining this character. But I actually think that framing of the movie is part of the core themes of what this is taking on head on, which is to say how women and certain stories get erased from the history books to focus on these stories of great men like Helm. Helm is in the film, he is the king of Rohan. He's the guy who can one-punch man anybody and kill them instantaneously and like wins this big battle against for the Rohirrim. But this story is sort of saying like, no, it's more complicated than that, and there's a much more complicated feelings than these just like heroes who stand up and represent like the kings of the people. It's actually about the compassion to understand the nature and the world around it, and women often get erased from that story because they aren't the ones allowed into these leadership roles within the patriarchy. And the movie even like has right up front, there's a sequence where they're sort of looking at when all these sort of houses of Rohan are coming they look and see, like, there's one house that hasn't really shown up, one group that hasn't shown up in many years. They don't even think they exist anymore. It's the Shield Maidens, a group of women who protected the realm using shields to protect, to like, not kill, but to protect. And that becomes an overall theme of, like, Hera, as this woman, does not get to take part in these structures, but she is such an integral part in keeping the compassion and the mercy alive in a way that she's in touch with nature. Like, there's points where, like, she talks to the eagles, and she's much more able to, like, commune with nature in a very Tolkienian way. That I think, like, this movie is centralizing, and how we erase that from our history books, despite them being very necessary parts of how Tolkien centralized his themes. And so it interests me the outrage merchants are getting angry about this character not being in the books, when Tolkien himself was someone who, if you look at a lot of his work, he was always about building out a mythology. The outrage merchants, when they get angry at Rings of Power, or even this work, or even some of the adaptations like The Hobbit, what they get angry at is like, oh, Tolkien didn't have this in his work. It was not part of his canon. It was not something that he intended to be there, so you're adding some stuff in. It's just fan fiction. And what Tolkien understood, if you look at a lot of his work, especially post Lord of the Rings, when he was sort of building out his Silmarillion, was that myth and storytellings are always going to change based on the context of the time and the world that they come within. And yes, there are these core themes and ethoses that he would go back to for myths to try and draw upon, but the stories are an evolving thing that change over time. And that's kind of what he wanted his Silmarillion to represent. He didn't, by the way, the Silmarillion wasn't done when he died. There was many different versions. The versions of the Silmarillion we have was compiled by Christopher Tolkien, his son, who kind of found the versions that were the most complete and most that worked with each other, and tried to put them all together. But that's where we get things like the Unfinished Tales or Tales of Middle-earth, these other books were like different drafts and versions of his story, because he was constantly sending them out to people, getting edits, and creating this sort of more mythology that that he was trying to build out as sort of like this evolving story, an evolving world that wasn't crystallized in amber, because that's how he understood how stories and mythology worked. And I think what I love about this film is it kind of takes that idea and says, okay, what's this sort of like looking at history and the tales that we can tell, and finding this woman who is a perspective that does get erased from history a lot, especially in our sort of Western culture stories, and try to center that, and what would that mean, and what would her perspective bring to this story that we already kind of know, and what would it inherently change about the themes and ideas of the work that could build upon Tolkien's themes, instead of like trying to co-opt them or change them or do something entirely new. Because a lot of this movie's words and work, I think, really centralizes that. And what's even more frustrating, because like the outrage merchants are always going to be the outrage merchants, right? They're always going to, you know, they're trying to uphold their sort of hegemonic worldview of the world, if I may use a big term in not my off-the-cuff review here. But they're trying to hold on to things like patriarchy and da-da-da-da-da. And so what they're doing is they're saying like, oh, a woman can't star in this thing because of some institutionalized norm. And the institution that they can draw upon, like normally in real life, they'll say like women can't be part of this because like there's a law that says this, or there's something like this, or like men and women are supposed to be separate because God said so. But when it comes to fantasy and science fiction, the institution they can draw upon is this like authorial intent of the author, this sort of crystallized institutional canon that they can create. But that's not how Tolkien viewed his own work, but that's what they draw upon. So it's just this interesting thing for the outrage merchants to be doing the very thing, like trying to use Tolkien to sort of like canonize his work, when even that's something that he didn't really think about. And this film is sort of inherently dealing with and grappling with. And the other element of it that I find fascinating is the just critical response to the film. Because if you go and look online, even people who aren't the outrage merchant grifters, like critics that I respect, and I still respect them, I'm not hating on them, but they sort of look at this film as like, oh, I saw a lot of reviews saying Hera is a very passive character, which is interesting to me watching the film, because I don't view her as passive at all. Throughout the beginning of the film, what it is trying to get at is she is a woman who is not allowed to be in charge of the battles. Like there's a moment, I think in like the first third of the movie, where her father Helm goes off into battle and he says, I need to protect you. I need to like save you here. You can't take part in the battle. And so she's not able to go and take part in it. And yet at the end of the day, she's part of like the main thrust of that moment to be able to get her people out of Rohan to Helm's Deep, the Riddermark. to be able to like preserve and save them, even when her father is sort of like going out and getting attacked and doesn't see the danger that's coming, as we later learn. I don't want to spoil too much about the film. And it's quite literally about like how she's seen as someone worthy of protection, and other characters, the enemy, the bad guy of the film, is sort of seeing her as an object to possess, but no one sees her as her own person and views her as her own full human being worthy of like taking on the mantle of leadership or of having agency in the story of her people. And yet she's the constant one there to protect them and making these choices. And so like the people saying she's too passive kind of frustrate me too, because the whole point is that she is not allowed to make these choices. And so like, yes, she's a passive character if like you view active story is like you get to take part in the battle at certain points and get to fight at certain points. But she's not a passive character because this story is an internal narrative. And it reminds me kind of very similar to, I saw the TV Glow recently, where like, I won't spoil that movie for those of you who have not seen it, but like that is a very overtly trans-metaphorical film. And it is a film that is kind of frustrating in that the main character is what we would typically deem a passive character in terms of not making specific choices throughout the movie. Again, I'm trying to stay general here. If you know, you know, if you've seen the film. And a lot of people are just like, oh, he's too passive of a main character. He's not making choices. I'm like, because the film is about that internal struggle that the character is making. The movie isn't about these like active like hero's journey myths that we tell of like getting to be the active purveyor of the story, but the internal struggle that these societal structures put upon us. But what I love about this movie, and this is where I'll start shifting more into like my actual review of the film, because I just wanted to discuss that discourse to get into the rest of the film, is that like, what I love about it is that it uses Hera, this woman, and like her perspective as a woman at this time, not just to be like, let's make a movie about like womanhood, but to use womanhood as a vehicle to grapple with Tolkien's larger themes about being able to be in connection more with nature, and not about vengeance or anger or destruction, but about preservation and about saving and recognizing the fullness of people, rather than just trying to protect them out of this like masculine dominance idea. And it's a really beautiful way of like recoding, recontextualizing a lot of the themes that Tolkien was grappling with, and putting them into a framework of patriarchy and sort of gender, but still getting at those same concepts and same ideas. So it's a different venue and a different structure to get at the same ideas and themes of his work. And I think it's really a deeply beautiful work on that level. To get into some of the technical stuff, just because this is technically a review, what I will say is the animation is overall really gorgeous. There are a couple moments here and there where I'm like, it feels like they could have done a little bit more if they had a little bit more budget, or like it doesn't work completely. I'm like a little bit thrown out of it. Like some of the background work doesn't mesh with the foreground work. But I think overall it is really, really beautiful. I think they do a great job of incorporating the Peter Jackson, because this is set in the sort of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings verse. Incorporating those same like models and things, but doing new things with them and new visuals with them instead of just repeating them. And that's the other thing I like about the film, is that like, outside of the end of the movie, where the end of the movie in the last like 5-10 minutes, there's like a couple things where it's very much like, and here's how we're gonna connect it to the Peter Jackson thing. Like you could tell like an executive probably had like a checkboard of like, make sure you have a cameo, make sure you have a reference to a character from the trilogy, make sure you explain the backstory of a certain thing from the trilogy, so we go, oh, look at that. Like it had that sort of like executive brain checklist all at the end. But for the most part, like while we were in the same settings of like Rohan and Helm's Deep, the movie never overly relies on that nostalgia, and it never feels like it is being like, and here's the thing that you know from before, but slightly worse because it's nostalgia. It's just here now. Look at that reference. It never really does that until the story is basically done. Like it tells its own story, and then it's like, all right, and here's all the Easter eggs that you want. Which if you're gonna have that stuff, at least you're just not distracting from your main narrative, and you're just kind of putting it at the end as like, and here's the thing for you nerds who may enjoy it. But it's not distracting. It's not relying on those things to tell your story. And even the one cameo, not even cameo, the cameo one I thought was pretty stupid. There's a reference to another character right at the very end that I actually think does kind of fit Hera's story and where she's going off to. And so I think that at least works. It is still a little bit of like, and here's this character that you know, but at least it's not completely out of left field it is somewhat relevant to what's happening in the story. I'm trying to get into some more stuff without spoiling all that much for you. There are some other gripes that I have is I wish some of the brother characters of Hera got a little bit more screen time. There are some issues that are general Lord of the Rings problems that come up in the film, like the bad guy characters being drawn with slightly darker skin than our hero characters, so that getting at the darker skin coding, they're not black necessarily, but they are coded as darker skin, and so there's a little bit of that racialization coding that even Tolkien himself was sort of grappling with after he had written the work. So that's in there, but that's a Lord of the Rings problem, not just this movie's problem. It's not dealing with that in any critical way, and maybe it should have, but it's not there, and it's doing a lot already, and it's 2-hour runtime. So it's just a thing that's there. Worth analyzing in the grand scheme of things, but not necessarily this movie's fault. Other things that I really love that don't get fully completed is there are a couple horror moments in the movie, kind of going back to that nature idea, especially early on. There's a sequence with an Oliphant that is actually really cool and reminded me actually a lot of Princess Mononoke, if you've seen that film, one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a sequence in this film that has kind of echoes of that. And it's really cool, really creepy, and really scary, despite it taking place fully in the daytime. And I loved it a lot. And while thematically it comes back again later on with some of the nature elements of it, it doesn't explain certain, some of the magical horror stuff that they were dealing with there. Maybe I missed it, but I don't think that's ever fully explained. Maybe it's allusions to other stuff going on that I could get to, like Lord of the Rings style stuff. But it's not really fully explained within the film itself, I don't believe. Someone will yell at me in the comments. But it is a cool sequence, and I did really like it. But yeah, I think that's everything I have to say. I heavily enjoyed this. It is unfortunate. I'm filming this on a Sunday night. It does look like the movie is not going to do well at the box office, which kind of sucks because, I actually think of all the post Lord of the Rings original trilogy things that have released, and that includes the Hobbit movies and the Lord of the Rings of Power. I think this is the best of all of them by a hot mile. Again, I have a soft spot for the first 2 Hobbit movies. I hate the 3rd Hobbit movie, but I have a soft spot for those movies, even though I know they're kind of messy. Same thing with Rings of Power. Season 1's a hot garbage mess, but it is my hot garbage mess. Season 2 I actually think is a significant improvement. It still has its problems, but I actually really like Rings of Power. I would argue Season 2 of Rings of Power is good, still very far from great, and has a lot of things to improve on, but still good, as opposed to Season 1, which was garbage, but my garbage. This is actually, I think, just a really solid film that knows what it wants to be, knows what it wants to say. It is by no means perfect in every sense, but I think is a cohesive story, a cohesive narrative that eschews some of the nostalgia stuff that we normally get in today's day and age to tell its own story, that bolsters Tolkien's themes, that uses a female protagonist and her perspective as a woman to tell the story. It's not just here's a story that we shove a woman into, like you would say, your Rey Skywalkers. Not to say I hate Rey Skywalker, but it's that was a movie where it was much what if Luke was girl? And the sexism that movie got was because sexism. Not, even though Rey was very much the same kind of character as Luke. But it wasn't really her perspective as a woman coming through in Force Awakens, and even arguably in Rise of Skywalker. A little bit in Last Jedi. Here, though, Hera's perspective as a woman is central to what this movie is trying to say and what it is doing with her character, but it is not just doing it to be let's talk about womanhood. It is using that perspective to get at these larger ideas. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing that this movie does. And frankly, if more franchise movies, not just Lord of the Rings, but Star Wars and Star Trek and other ones, were doing stuff like this with the IP, and actually bolstering the themes of a work rather than just reselling nostalgia or doing the thing that you liked from before, just slightly newer. I think that we would be in a much better place with where Hollywood is with IP usage, let's just say. And it sucks that this movie is not going to do as well, it seems. Though we don't know the cost-benefit analysis. That's something for some executive to do. Because I would really, honestly, if they wanted to do another animated movie that did a first stage story, to tell me some Morgoth shit, do the Silmarils, or like a Baron and Luthien story. Like an animated Baron and Luthien story would be phenomenal, and I think could be really a beautiful thing. But it does not seem that there would be a market for that. And also the rights discussion is its own whole thing, because this, again, based on the appendices. So do what you will with that. But yeah, I like this movie. I liked it a lot. I'd love to hear your thoughts, though, because I'm rambling at this point. And beyond all of that, my friends, I hope y'all live long and prosper.